Yeah, okay, so hello everyone, thanks for joining this session. We're delighted to be discussing Irish Republicanism since 1969 with our esteemed panel today for this topic. And obviously to begin with as well, thanks very much for the GW4 funding our Island of Ireland Contemporary History and Politics Network. And we're covering different thematic points with the conflict and peace process and politics. And today, as we said, we're looking at Irish Republicanism since 1969. I'll introduce our panel in turn. So for our end, we've got Tommy McKearney, who's a former Irish Republican prisoner and also has been an author themselves and has been working in trade unions in time more recent. Next to Tommy, we've got Dr Marisa McGlinchey from Coventry University. Dr McGlinchey has an award-winning book, Unfinished Business, and also studies all different things related to Northern Ireland politics, peace process, and more. I'll come to myself last, so we'll do Danny Morrison's next. So Danny Morrison's the former Sinn Fein Director of Publicity and is an author themselves. And lastly for me, so I'm Dr Thomas Leahy, and I'm a senior lecturer in British and Irish politics here at Cardiff University. And my main work looks at Irish Republicanism, and my first book, British Intelligence War Against the IRA, was released in 2020. So the way the format will work for our discussion this afternoon, we're going to respond in turn to different questions. We'll let Danny and Tommy have first say with questions, and then me and Marisa and then me for each question will add any further thoughts if we have any. Just as a general introduction for people perhaps not familiar to the topic, we'll take you up to the start of the conflict in north of Ireland or Northern Ireland, and essentially had partition, which by the 1920s is separating 26 of Ireland's southern counties from the 6 of the island of Ireland's northeast. And by the 1960s, and we'll talk about that shortly, partly because of partition, but also because of a civil rights movement that emerged in Northern Ireland because of the Unionist, Ulster Unionist Protestant British government discrimination against Irish Catholic population there. The civil rights movement emerged, and thereafter there was a breakdown essentially in what the British state and Unionists would call law and order because of the refusal to grant the civil rights movement's demands. So British troops are then sent in August 1969 with intercommunal fighting, and we'll pick up a bit more about the British government's involvement in the conflict in our discussion. So my first question is, what do you feel were the core objectives for Irish Republicanism from 1969? And we'll start with Danny, if that's okay.
Well, of course, the Republican movement, and particularly the IRA, had been around for a long, long time. Basically, after partition, its role, certainly in urban centres, like for example in Derry or Armagh, Belfast, was to protect the nationalist community at times of threat. My own grandparents were twice driven from their homes after partition. So there had been a border campaign from 1956 to 1962, attacks on customs posts, attacks on rural barracks close to the border, and it didn't have mass support. The IRA recognised that, called an end to it, but then after people were finally released from jail, the Republican movement began to experiment with politics. Sinn Fein was a proscribed organisation, so in West Belfast in the October 1964 general election, Billy McMillan, a former prisoner, was put forward as a Republican candidate but not as Sinn Fein. And in response to him putting an Irish tricolour in his window in a 100% nationalist area, Ian Paisley, who was a young firebrand, up-and-coming demagogue, threatened 1,000 Protestants to come into West Belfast and take the flag out. Instead, the police came in and took it out, and there was riots, etc. So there's, again, after 1960, that was 1964, 1966, when we have the 50th anniversary of the Easter Rising, the government of Stormont bans all public transport from coming into West Belfast, trains, buses, in order to minimise those who were in attendance. I remember the parade, it was huge, it was colourful. But within a few weeks we paid the price for that, because a loyalist organisation called the UVF, the Ulster Volunteer Force, styled itself on the original UVF, which had opposed Home Rule back in 1912. They killed 2 people, one of whom was his mother was my next door neighbour, and that was the start of the violence I mean, as I say, the IRA had stopped fighting after the '62 border campaign, and that was the start. That was the price we had to pay for wanting independence, for wanting our rights. Now, there had been a number of groups like the Campaign for Social Justice, other school teachers, solicitors, had throughout the history of the North been compiling statistics. There was a former editor of the Irish Press, wrote a book in the 1940s outlining the discrimination that was taking place against the nationalist community in the North. And they all came together around 1966, 1967. In fact, the first meeting was in the home in Mahara of a solicitor called Kevin Agnew, who later was my election agent whenever I stood in Mid-Ulster in 1982, some years later. And they formed a civil rights association with very simple demands. An end to the repressive legislation, the Special Powers Act, which had suspended habeas corpus and resulted from the start of the state right up until now. There's only been one period of 2 years when there have been no political prisoners in jails in the north of Ireland. And that was from about 1951 to 52 or 53. So they had very simple demands. An end to gerrymandering. So you had, for example, for 50 years, Derry, which had a nationalist majority, they so drew up the borders that a unionist minority ruled Derry, ruled where houses were built, ruled where industry was located. And in other areas they had what was called the business vote. And because the unionist community, the Protestant community, was much more wealthy than the Catholic community and owned more shops, they got extra votes for the shops. Whereas if people who were of voting age, say 21 back then, lived at home with their parents because there was no houses for them, they didn't get a vote, but their mother and father got a vote. And this way it skewed the whole political process. You're talking about 250,000 people probably being disenfranchised. The demands were actually for British rights, because that's how it was framed. Let's go looking here for British rights. And the response of the Stormont government was repression. Similarly, there was a lot of bombs going off in 1969, for which the IRA was blamed, but it was loyalists who were behind it. And there is credible evidence that Ian Paisley was also involved in that. Inside the Republican movement, people were open to the idea of participating in politics, electoral politics. People were open to the idea of getting involved in civil rights campaigns for limited demands. But there was also a section within the IRA which was quite worried about the situation. So, for example, you had people saying, and I was slightly involved in this to the fringe as a listener, because I had an uncle who had been senior member of the IRA earlier and had been once sentenced to death. So I was able to listen to what was going on from different factions. And people were saying, every time we have tried to get close to our rights, so for example, at the time of Home Rule, where it looked like the British government was going to introduce Home Rule, Dominion Rule for all of Ireland, the Loyalists thwarted it through the threat of civil war. Similarly, they refused to, when the Boundary Commission was being set up, to decide the actual how many counties or districts would be involved in the fledgling new Northern Ireland state. Violence was threatened at that stage. Or people were driven out of their houses in the 20s, or people were driven out of their houses in the 30s. And this section was saying to the leadership, we need to be prepared. If we're going to demand for civil rights, there's going to be a reprisal, there's going to be repression. And they weren't prepared. And so in August 1969, our areas were invaded. I was in Divis Street on 14th of August 1969 when the Loyalists poured down from the Shankville Road, where the B Specials, a 100% Protestant paramilitary part-time organisation, was mobilised by the government, and the RUC came into our districts opening fire from Shoreland armoured cars into built-up areas. Killed 9-year-old Patrick Rooney, killed a British soldier, first British soldier killed, was killed by the RUC. And barricades went up, and after that there was tensions within the IRA and the Republican movement over the fact that the leadership had ignored the warning that was coming from people who had been around for a long time. And the tensions eventually broke. They broke over a number of issues. As a young person, to me, I wasn't interested in the ideological and the political arguments that were going on. So, for example, the leadership back then had been advocating that the Republican movement abandon all of its previous policies. So that is, they would actually take seats in Stormont, which back then was totally unreformed. It was a unionist citadel. That they would take seats in the south of Ireland, in Leinster House. And of course, that was linked to a split in the IRA in 1921, which led to a civil war, the setting up of the Free State, and the abandonment of the Irish Republic, and taking seats in Westminster. And this was totally, to many of us, this was loathsome. But to me, my criticism of the leadership was that they were warned that we were going to be attacked, and they hadn't brought in arms to defend the area. And so most of my coevals, 16, 17-year-olds, we tended to side with after the split with the group that came known to set up a Provisional Army Council. The media immediately dubbed them the Provisional IRA, although that was never its name. And the other group became the official Republican movement. Both sides, for the officials for a limited period, fought against the British Army, which had been brought in August 1969 into our areas, allegedly to defend us, but within weeks were attacking us. Within months, curfewed to Falls Road, the area that had suffered hundreds of homes being burnt down in August 1969, and now in July 1970, the British Army gases this small working class community from the air, drops gas into the air, comes in shooting, shoots dead 5 people, arrests like 250 people, wounds 30 people, for weapons that had never been used against the British Army. And that again was a turning point. So if you go across the north of Ireland, the nationalist area, every time, each area does not necessarily decide to support the IRA at the same time. Often it comes about through family connections, through tradition, or through an incident that happens. So, for example, the hunger strikes in 1981 moves people towards the IRA. The killings in Gibraltar in 1988 moves people towards the IRA. Internment, Bloody Sunday, and for my generation, August 69, when we were burnt out of our homes, and the curfew in 1970. So that sets the pace. And the argument then is that we still want to get our civil rights. The Republican movement said we're not going to get our civil rights until we get our national rights. And that means taking on the state. And the basis for it, remember at this stage, Reginald Maudling, who was the British Home Secretary, had declared war on the IRA. Brian Faulkner, who was a Stormont Prime Minister, when he introduced internment, declared war on the IRA. Then, of course, it was never a war. It didn't suit them publicly, propaganda-wise, after that, to declare that it was a war. But it was a guerrilla war. And it was the continuation of the thwarted War of Independence, which was thwarted by partition and by the establishment of the Free State in 1921.
Great, thanks so much, Danny, for your thoughts on that. We'll go to Tommy next. So, same question is, what do you feel were the core objectives for Irish Republicanism from 1969?
Well, I think we've got to take what Danny has said into consideration, which is a very comprehensive outline of the background to the situation. But I think what we've got to look at is why people would want a republic. And the republic always was seen as the answer to our problems, to break out of the encirclement that we've been in. And I think we look back to the original early days of the 19th century and ask ourselves what happened when, for example, in 1848 there was a failed uprising, and some of those that fled the rising remember this was as a result of the famine. A million people died as a result of the Irish famine. A million immigrated. The population of Ireland still hasn't recovered from it, to be honest. But a group who had taken part in the uprising fled to France, and there they met some of the French revolutionaries who told them that there had never been a famine in France since the end of the days of the French aristocracy, with the revolution in France. So what they said was, to break out of the famine situation, you have to break the aristocracy. To break the aristocracy, you have to set up a republic. You have to get rid of the monarchy. And to do that, you lead a secret insurrectionary revolutionary movement. So 10 years later, these revolutionaries come back to Ireland and established that same underground movement. And they called it the Irish Republican Brotherhood. And the Irish Republican Brotherhood's armed wing became the Irish Republican Army, the IRA. But the objective was to address the underlying issues that had caused the famine, and caused the distress that had been in Ireland. And to do that, it was necessary to break out of the system that had existed at the time, set up a republic, an independent republic. Now, in the early days, for the most part of the 19th century, the republic that was sought was a peasants' republic, to address the underlying issue of land, need for land and access to land meant life because of what had happened through the famine. Later on, it became to establish the republic also included to bring in the working class. Now, if we move forward to the 1960s, the late 1960s, particularly for the Catholic working class, and we're using the word Catholic in terms of community rather than theologically, to break free from the cruel discrimination and repression. Keep in mind that the state of Northern Ireland had been based on repression from the word go. Danny has talked about his grandparents having been driven from their homes, pogroms in the 1920s, pogroms in the 1930s. And in 1969, whenever the attacks were made on Catholic areas in Belfast, one entire street, Bombay Street, just behind Clonard Monastery, was burnt to the ground. A young lad trying to help the people evacuated was shot dead. Many innocent Catholic civilians were shot by the RUC, not by loyalists, not by unionists, but by the RUC, the arm of the state. The first people to die in the what we call the troubles, if we like to use that term, of the conflict, were killed by the RUC. The first two casualties were beaten to death with batons. Shot dead then, as we've talked about, a young 9-year-old child shot dead in his bed with an RUC. This was the state's armed police force, attacked Catholic areas, machine gunned residential flats, shot dead a 9-year-old sleeping in his bed, and an serving British soldier on home and leave. So to break that, it was necessary to establish a republic, to break connection not only with England, but to establish a completely different system of administration and government. And for that reason, the republic became the objective. And that was the logic behind it. So to set that up, because nothing else, the state was totally irreformable, the state couldn't be moved. It took an armed insurrection, was deemed to be the only answer to end the nightmare that was faced. It wasn't just simply some sort of a aspiration, some sort of a distant aspiration that we wanted and loved to have a united Ireland. It was the necessity of having a different economic, social, political system that would guarantee the rights of people and protect people, which meant that it was more than just an aspiration for unity. The aspiration for unity was there, admittedly, but to end the nightmare that had been faced by the Catholic population in the 6 counties, it was necessary to break free from Britain, to break partition and establish a republic. And that was why the republic became so important, the new republic.
Great, thanks very much for that, Tommy. And next up, Marisa, same question. What do you feel were the core objectives for Irish Republicanism from 1969?
When I was listening to both Danny and Tommy, when I think of 69, I always think about the fact that the provisional IRA didn't emerge into a Republican vacuum. You know, as Danny and Tommy have both said, there were active Irish Republicans long before 1969. And so the events of 1969, which sparked things off, really brought together older Republicans who had been active for decades and decades, as well as new younger recruits and people that were, as Danny said, responding on the ground in a very real sense to things that were happening around them. So you talked there about Bombay Street. My family was one of the families that were burnt out of Clonard during that burning. So things like that, internment, where mass arrests were taking place, the Falls Road curfew, Bloody Sunday, all these events were all key things for people being drawn to the IRA, to the Republican movement. But as I say, I think for me it's important to recognise that it brings together also, it's a much longer tradition. And yes, 1969 sparked off the most recent phase, but there were Republicans active there in the north and south long before the events of 1969 happened. So in terms of the objectives, to add basically to what's been said, yes, I think that they were multiple. I think they were reacting to events on the ground in the north in places like Belfast, Derry and other places, like the burning of Bombay Street, the defence of communities, as well as wanting Irish unity, unification of Ireland, and a very specific type of Irish unity where people had control of their own destiny and where British interference was removed from Ireland. And I think that's from 1969, all those objectives were brought together.
Yeah. And my own thoughts on this, so I would say, I think, the two things Danny, Tommy and Marisa have said, three things really in a sense, going on in terms of motivating the campaign and what the objectives were. And, Irish unification was a key part of that, but I think, as we've been saying, that the two things would have been seen as together. There's, partly now, maybe like politically on the island of Ireland, there'll be debates about, was it linked to the civil rights movement, was it linked to the campaign? Like, my own view on that would be, yes, it would have been linked to the civil rights movement, in the sense there's a discussion going on about, well, if the kind of political route is shut down from what we can see in terms of trying to achieve civil rights, then having a campaign for United Ireland is part of producing civil rights, because otherwise the two seemed, in a sense, you couldn't just have civil rights from, I think, the Republican perspective if you maintain the Northern Ireland state. And that partly goes back to partition and why, what was the kind of main objective of the northern state being there in the first place. And you have the kind of quite well known comments in the 30s from Sir James Craig, one of Northern Ireland's prime ministers, said, this is a Protestant parliament for Protestant people. So when there's then resistance once you get to the 60s, as we said, about granting of civil rights, and as Danny was using that phrase, and the civil rights movement used that itself, British rights for British citizens, one person, one vote, housing allocated by need, not by your background, like political views or seemingly religious views, etc. So I think that in that sense, that the two things were seen as in tandem for the Republican movement. If you want your civil rights from their perspective, then the IRA's campaign would have been a key part of that, and the push towards unification. The other thing I would add to this, I think certainly from the Republican leadership, more so later on in the conflict, like the 80s and 90s, under as figureheads like Gerry Adams, Martin McGuinness, but there would have been other people there, crucial as well, that I think, they would have been willing to, the key thing was getting then to the negotiating table and then seeing, what can you get from the negotiations? And of course you'd have your core objectives. That's not me saying these people don't want Irish unification, yes they do. But there would have been a willingness, for reasons we'll touch on later, as the conflict went on, that, well, this is our maximum objectives, but what are the kind of key things in the meantime that we might accept as a settlement? And that partly comes back to be said, like the civil rights issues and ongoing things that might not have been sorted going to the early 70s being resolved, and Irish self-determination in some form being granted. And there would have been, of course, nationalism and republicanism, a debate about what form should that self-determination take. But there was a kind of general consensus that that was an issue that needed to be solved as part of the peace settlement, which you get later on. But I actually think from quite an early point, even in the early 70s, the Republican leadership at that point, so again, just to figureheads, Rory O'Brien and Daithí O'Connell, they would have had different ideas, like the Éire Nua plan in terms of if you had a United Ireland, you base it on 4 provinces. And even then, and my point with that is to show, and various academic work has showed this, that Republican movement wasn't just United Ireland from centralised Dublin government or would come under rule from Dublin and that's it. There was a sophistication to the political thinking of the movement, even in the early stages of the conflict, thinking, well, okay, if you rejigged what they would see as 9-county Ulster rather than, as Ulster Protestants might refer to, the 6 counties of what then became the Northern Ireland area, that essentially that would help to rebalance, if Ulster Protestant fears, if they claimed, we're going to be discriminated against if we come under any form of Irish nationalist rule, you would have almost 50-50 in the kind of Northern Parliament. And my key points there is, yes, it was about unification. Yes, it was about also the civil rights points as well, where the two would have been seen in tandem. But the movement and the leadership of the movement at different points would have been willing to, at least try and have negotiations and discussions with their opponents, particularly unionism, in terms of how would you rejig the situation on the island of Ireland if partition was ended. Okay, so the second question, we'll start with Tommy this time on this question, is What's your view on why did some Irish nationalists living in the north, but also some people in the Republic as well, why did people join the Irish Republican Army in your view? And partly we might have commented on some of those factors already, but anything else that you think is key on that question?
Well, I'd say there's a number of reasons. Sometimes it's history, family history, because we've had a long history of insurrectionary movements in Ireland, at least 200 years, 2 centuries, from the United Irishmen in 1798. But very few countries in Western Europe would have the same insurrectionary tradition, because after all, it's been fairly well established that Ireland alone was the only country in Western Europe that's colonised. So there's been an anti-colonial movement for a long, long time in Ireland. So to an extent there was history involved, families with history. A lot of members of the IRA had relatives in the past, parents, grandparents involved in the movement, anti-colonialist movement. But then, of course, the big thing is circumstances, conditions. Conditions, as we've outlined, was the brutality of the state. That there comes a time usually, and it's never something that can easily be defined, but a critical point comes when people will decide that they have tried every other option, but the only option left is to rebel, to opt for insurrection. So that's what happened, and of course there's a significant number of events. There was the 1869 events when particularly Belfast was laid siege to by the Catholic population in Belfast, were put under pressure. Because historically, since the foundation of the Northern Ireland state, Belfast to an extent was held hostage to, the Catholic population of Belfast was treated as held hostage to the good behaviour of the rest of the Catholic population in the 6 counties. It had been penalised for attempting to break out of the partitionist state in the 1920s, brutal treatment programmes in the 1920s, again in the 1930s. And by the 1960s, it was obvious that this was again happening, so it was either stand and take it or fight back. And within a series of very short period of time, there was an escalating series of events, as we've explained before. 69, then 70, siege of the Lower Falls, and that stage meant that the British Army, which had been portrayed as neutral peacekeepers, had lost whatever credibility as a peacekeeping force it had when it took a one-sided position, particularly under a new Tory regime. And then by 1971, with internment, it had whatever chance there had been of doing what was at one stage believed to be an option, that with sufficient pressure being put on central government in London, that London would intervene positively to end the discriminatory Orange state. That with the introduction of internment, the one-sided introduction of internment supported and conducted by the regular British Army, whatever prospect there was of London intervening positively with a progressive message had been abandoned. And then any doubts that there was remaining were swept away with the slaughter in Derry a few months later in Bloody Sunday. So at that stage, particularly with internment and Bloody Sunday, a lot of young people said to themselves that this has went on for long enough. We have no option now but to fight, either lie down or fight back. And for this occasion, and it's possible to say why fight back then rather than maybe in the 50s or the 30s or the 40s, but spark falls. Sometimes they say that history, nothing changes from a century, and then a century happens within a few days, as Lenin himself said. And that was what happened in that period of time. And particularly working class members of the Catholic community who had borne the brunt of the repression and the discrimination and the mistreatment joined in very significant numbers within the IRA. But not only that, and sometimes we talk about membership of the IRA as if it was distinct from the community. The IRA would not have existed and survived for as long as it did, or waged the campaign it without very significant wholehearted support from within the communities. And for that reason the communities contributed, and time will tell that it wasn't just the actual active volunteers, but it was the people behind them that really kept the campaign and insurrection in place. Because it was a community at war with the British state. It wasn't just a handful of volunteers or X number of volunteers, it was a community.
Great, thanks so much for that, Tommy. And turning to Danny, same question. What's your views on why did some people join the IRA in your view?
Just before I answer that question, I just want to go back to the background to the re-emergence of the IRA as a mainstream force within the nationalist community. We don't know what would have happened had the Stormont Unionist government brought in one man, one vote prior to August 1969, or had they ended gerrymandering in Derry. There were concessions made, but each concession was made too late when the argument had changed course. So, for example, we had got a housing executive introduced in 1971. We had the Fair Employment Agency introduced in 1976. It took many, many years, using support from America, to bring in a change about working conditions where there can be no sectarian emblems and no attempt to put down people through the McBride principles. That was a big campaign as well. So, what we do know is this: if the Ulster Unionist government had signed a Good Friday Agreement at Easter 1969, not one person would have lost their life in the north. But it was their refusal, and later, whenever the DUP became the largest party representing the unionist population, their reluctance and their refusal to accept any type of measures of equality or a level playing field that fed into the conflict. We actually saw this in John Hume, where John Hume, perhaps not too happy about the way he expressed it, but I think he was expressing something real when on the day after Bloody Sunday he turned around and says, it's a United Ireland or nothing. And by that reflected the fact that it was now much bigger. It was now about the British have no right to be here, and this has been the problem from day one, for 8 centuries. From when republicanism was set up in 1790, in the 1790s, from the country being split by Britain again against the wishes of all of the people there, both north and south, in the government of Ireland Act 1920. So it had now become something fundamental. What Tommy was saying there about this, this is an anti-colonial situation. Britain is an imperial power. They created, from the original settler colonial situation, they created the Unionists, they pandered to the Unionists, they armed the Unionists, they financed the Unionists, they actually ultimately abused the Unionists because the mindset arose that they were supreme, they were supremacists, they can march through our area. They marched on the Falls Road. You weren't sure to march on the Falls Road when I was a youngster. And played God Save the Queen. We weren't allowed even to march into town on St. Patrick's Day. It was illegal to fly the Union flag. Our music wasn't played on the radio. Our sports weren't covered by the BBC. There was the mountain of discrimination. It's only when you look at that you can then understand the fuel that was behind the armed struggle. I mean, for example, in Tyrone and Fermanagh, they originally, on the basis of the Boundary Commission, they should have been in the 28 counties. So when you consider the anger of that population up there, they were almost out of this sectarian configuration, and instead they were forced against their will into it. So I admire particularly people from the 26 counties who joined the IRA, because they didn't have the British soldier putting you up against the wall, humiliating you, beating you up, arresting you, bringing you into the barracks. All of that treatment that went on day after day after day, where you were afraid to walk down the street, you were afraid to come home from a dance at night because of what you would meet with the British Army. And yet, large numbers of the people who formed the bombing campaign in England were from the 26 counties. Another young lad, Joseph McManus from Sligo, was killed in Fermanagh on active service in the 1990s. Those people, they made up a decision based on what they could see, not solely on the emotion that they had physically, personally experienced, and I greatly admire them. But in the north, it was regenerative. You know, the area where I came from in Ivy area wasn't considered a Republican area. And yet if you go down that street, you know, I went to jail, my brother went to jail, Ted Hall went to jail, his brother was assassinated. Across the street, the two McLarens went to jail. Further up the street, Geordie Duffy went to jail 3 times. Eddie Duffy went to jail. Eddie was tortured by the British. And all of these people have brothers and sisters and cousins and school friends and relatives, and they weren't going to accept this. So the support for the prisoners was incredible throughout the whole campaign. Remember, the people who were marching on Bloody Sunday, it was a Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association march, but they were demanding the ending of internment, the closure of Long Kesh and Armagh Jail and McGilligan and the prison ship in Maidstone. So the situation had just been completely transformed by the fact that the British government sent the British Army in against the wishes of the Irish government, who wanted UN forces to come in, and they were 18 months out of killing people in Aden, and within 18 months they were killing people in Belfast, because that's what the British Army does. And it was their brutality in support of the status quo, the Unionist government, one party rule for 50 years. It was their policy, their repression, which created a situation, this chemical situation, where young people were going to fight back. Now, maybe they hadn't read about Wolfe Tone, maybe they weren't into James Connolly, but they knew, as people around the world know, that if you are oppressed, you will resist, or you will go under. And many people did go under, because it's not easy to fight. It's not easy to go to jail. It's not easy to get wounded or get killed, or to lose friends and comrades. But that was done, and it was done, it had passed a tipping point where nothing that they could do. So they used everything. They tortured, that didn't work. They shot people on the streets, they used plastic bullets against civilian marchers, they killed kids that way. They had supergrass trials, they had shoot to kill, they recruited the loyalists en masse. Remember, whenever Lord Stevens, who the British former head of the Metropolitan Police, came over to look at collusion, he thought he was coming there for 5 months. He ended up coming back and forth for 15 years. And he showed that out of 240 loyalists that he interviewed, 220 of them were working for British intelligence agencies. So the loyalists were used as a counter guy. They were armed by British intelligence, and that didn't defeat us either. And we reached a point in the 1990s where a lot of people privately, both in the IRA and the British Army, and then the British Army publicly, were stating, we have a military stalemate. You had like Brigadier James Glover, former commander of law enforcement in North of Ireland, said we cannot defeat the IRA. There has to be a political settlement. And it was that process, along with other initiatives, for example, Jay Adams and John Hume discussing the way forward, amongst others, that's what triggers and crystallises a peace process. But if the British thought that they could wipe the eye of the Republican community, which had come through so much, and I'm not talking about from 1969, I'm talking about from 1920, and if you want to go back before that again, if they thought they were going to be able to wipe the eye, they had another thing coming. Because when John Major, initially when they said, oh, if you speak, Sinn Fein will be in talks, if you ceasefire, Sinn Fein will be in talks, and then the IRA ceasefire, and Sinn Fein wasn't in talks. You have to go through a period of decontamination. What happened? The IRA planted a car bomb at Canary Wharf. The IRA went back to war, and then within a week, Prime Minister John Major says, okay, I accept George Mitchell as a chairperson of independent talks. And that's what triggered the second part of the peace process, which leads to the Good Friday Agreement.
Great, thanks for those thoughts. Marisa, next up, why did people join the IRA in your view?
We spoke at Trinity a couple of weeks in Dublin, and actually what I was speaking about then was why people in the south joined the IRA, and it was quite interesting because I interviewed quite a lot of them in all different parts of the south, Cork, Kerry, Dublin, all over really, Mayo, and they were saying there was a family tradition, you know, that Tommy's alluded to, but some of them said that they'd no republicanism in their family whatsoever, but they were very affected by the events in the north and what were happening, and that's why they went and they joined the IRA. Also, some of them were talking about very strong Republican ideology and very strongly wanting a united Ireland. So, as I said before, all these factors coming together for people in the south, why they would join the IRA. But in the north, I mean, I think, you know, it would be interesting to see if the civil rights movement if those demands had been granted, I think things would have been very, very different, as Danny says, very different. But people in the north, when I've spoke to them about why did you join the IRA, they talk about things like, the hunger strikes. I mean, that was massive. People say that the hunger strikes were one of the biggest recruiting agents for the IRA, because people were so outraged by what was happening that there were streets around, street queues of people wanting to join the IRA. And also, as Danny alluded to, about, people's brothers, sisters, mothers, father were being interned, they were being arrested, they were going to jail. People were very, very angry. People talked to me about, P-checks, stop and searches, when they were just going about their daily business. So really, the behaviour of the British Army was a massive factor in recruiting people into the IRA, because they were experiencing all this on a day and daily basis. And so I think when you bring all that together, the ideology, the failure of any positive demand or positive reaction to the civil rights demands, and then what people were actually experiencing on the ground. When you bring that all together, I think that's why so many people joined the IRA.
Yeah, excellent. And I concur with what Danny, Marisa and Tommy have said, and I think you've definitely got there the kind of long-term factors are playing a role as well, in terms of, certain families and family tradition would have been like anti-partition since the northern state came into being. And partly, if you look back on a long-term tradition, and this might be something where we have, there's 2 video discussions you'll see related to ourselves on the panel. This might be something to pick up more in a public event, which some people might be watching after this one. And, there's a question like, why don't Sinn Fein take their seats in Westminster? Now, Danny's partly talked about that earlier, because partly is a thing during the conflict, and prior to that also, since 1918, you don't want to seem to legitimise like British rule on the island of Ireland. But actually, important there, when we talk about being like anger towards partition, is the fact that an early precursor of the Sinn Fein party won the Westminster general election in 1918 for the island of Ireland, if you add up their seats compared to other parties. And then they made it quite clear that we're going to declare an independent republic, which they did, and then the British government prorogued it and shut it down, and then essentially, in my view anyway, which is what would lead to the what some people would term like the Irish War of Independence, which leads eventually to the formation, which later becomes the Republic by 1949. So the key point is, that would be there for particular families and people joining the IRA. And I think the points we've been talking about, particularly living in the border, like County Tyrone and Fermanagh, I mean, they had nationalist, we could call it like Irish Catholic majorities at the time of partition. So there's a question, well, why are these then put into what was seen as like the British Protestant state? And so there'll be, communal memory, if you want to call it that, that's still remaining by the time we get up to the 1960s from partition onwards. And I definitely agree that, definitely once we then have the discrimination from the unionist state, which is going on from the 1920s onwards, that, that's obviously going to, particularly when the civil rights movement is being, if we can call it attempted moves off the street of the civil rights movement by the state, that obviously that's going to reactivate, in particular family discussions, in the sense that, well, hang on a minute, this is why potentially we can't get civil rights in the state. And obviously thereafter as well, once British forces come in, you add in another ingredient, which is the fact that we talked about various events there, the Falls Road curfew and internment without trial, which was, to begin with, just essentially totally focused on the nationalist community. No lawyers were arrested initially at all. And things like Bloody Sunday, obviously, in 1972, 14 unarmed civilians were shot dead. And obviously afterwards, that was the kind of double insult with this for the nationalist communities, and the British government's official inquiry said, oh, it's the marchers' fault. It was their reason. They were, threatening security forces, etc. So definitely, it's a combination of those things. And I think one other point I'd say on this is that point, because sometimes certainly, different academic writers, there'll be a question, well, how come there's other people who support the Social Democratic Labour Party, so the SDLP, who would see themselves like a constitutional party during the conflict, so why was there other nationalists who didn't get involved in the IRA and Sinn Fein? And I think, again, one of the key points we're talking about here, it depends where you were living, and it depends particularly for working class areas of the cities, and specifically, they would have borne the brunt of the security force behaviour at the beginning of the conflict and action. So I think that can partly explain, why is that the case? And it partly then, goes into this debate and discussion about was Republicans fighting for civil rights? And yes, the people who were joining it, that's how they saw it. They saw the two things would link together, and the start for them on the campaign. Right, so the next question, which is jumping forward a little bit in time, is about the peace process. So, and the question with this is, why did the Irish Republican Army the IRA and Sinn Fein accept the Good Friday Agreement in your view? We'll go with Danny with this one first.
Well, you also referenced there, the SDLP existing and the SDLP did exist and had a monopoly on electoral representation of the nationalist community, because back in the 70s, certainly, whenever I was involved, the priority was armed struggle. It wasn't running for elections, and in fact, because of the complicated history of the Republican movement and the divisions that have occurred whenever you go political or constitutional, you go right back to the oath of allegiance to the British King in 1921, which is one of the objections put up against the treaty, when it should be our country is partitioned. But the Free Staters sold that argument because there's going to be a boundary commission and it'll render the northern state economically unviable, and then there'd be United Ireland, and that was bought and was called a stepping stone to an Irish Republic. But there's all down the years, Fianna Fáil split from Sinn Fein in 1925 or 1926. There's splits in the 30s, there's splits in the 40s, political splits, to the extent that actually Brendan Behan joked about it. The writer and playwright Brendan Behan says, when there's a Republican meeting, the first item on the agenda is the split. Jokingly. But that is the case, and of course we split in 1969 because of different approaches to what the conflict was. The officials back then were arguing against history, that we unite the working classes together, and then we get united, and then we get a united Ireland. And that was never going to be the case, because what you had was in the unionist working class was a privileged working class, a working class that had a stake in sectarianism and in the nature of the state. So that was never going to work. In coming forward politically, we decided, I remember in 1977, I think it was Daithí O'Connell, myself, Jerry Adams just come out of jail, and we were talking about the future and future tactics and strategies, and the talk of taking part in elections was mentioned, because Bernadette McAliskey, or Bernadette Devlin, back in 1969 had been elected in Mid-Ulster. Prisoners had been elected, by the way, both in Fermanagh, South Tyrone, and in Mid-Ulster, and in Leitrim and in Roscommon in the 1950s. So there was a tradition of electoralism, well, abstentionism as well. So even where if we stood in a Westminster election, if we were elected, we wouldn't be taking a seat at Westminster, and I have very strong views on that. I just would not support any party taking seats in Westminster. What happened at Stormont was different kettle of fish, and Leinster House different kettle of fish. They are assemblies of the Irish people, not Westminster, which claims jurisdiction here, which I reject. So we had a situation where there was a long armed struggle fought. We thought it was going to be short. It was pretty intense in 1972. Remember, people sent people before Christmas. By Christmas, I was engaged to have long cash, and it wasn't over, and it wasn't over the following year, and it went on for a very long time, to the extent that in the 1990s, the IRA, through a series of rearming, was in a position to probably fight on forever. Even with attrition rates, it could fight on because it was so heavily armed. I don't know whether the Republican movement could have comfortably negotiated and brought the base with it if that hadn't been the situation where they were negotiating or a position of weakness. But as it is, from where I was in jail when the ceasefire was called, they were negotiating from a position of strength. Now, in the run-up to the peace talks, the problem was always going to be this. The Irish government and the SDLP, at this stage the SDLP, it's not until 2001 that Sinn Fein overtakes the SDLP in the north. So the SDLP sort of has the mandate for the nationalist community. And the big danger was that it was quite obvious that in negotiations, they would always, what your ambitious demands would be from a Republican point of view, would be circumscribed by their small-mindedness, their lack of imagination, by their conformity, by their constitutional mindset. And that was the same for the Dublin government, which would be acting out of its own self-interest. So it was a tough thing to buy into. I mean, Stormont to me was the symbol of my second-class citizenship. And I covered the negotiations. I was writing for The Guardian back then, and I covered the negotiations during the talks. But I saw the value in it. I saw the pragmatism in it. I saw that this was a way of disarming the state in its mindsets. I saw this as a way of communicating with unionists and we had been hostile to each other and killed each other. I saw this as a way of building relations, and eventually, if we were in a position of being in government in the south and government in the north, using the cross-border bodies and the All-Ireland bodies, which were there in the Good Friday Agreement, to build towards some sort of social economic harmonisation. Now, it's still a work in progress. To me, it's still an experiment. And it may not work. Because, all of the evidence is that there's no way can you reform to perfection the six-county state. That its foundations are rotten, that you're always, regardless of how generous and reconciliatory you want to be, or conciliatory you want to be, unionism is just not in a position to come along with you. Having said that, as a result, I work with lots of peace groups. I meet former IUC men, former British soldiers, loyalists. There's a really interesting development where a lot of, and particularly as a result of Brexit and the alienation this has produced amongst certain sections of the unionist community in the north. I know Protestants from the Newton Ards Cumber area, and they're going back and they're looking at, hold on a minute, our great-great-grandparents were part of the United Irishmen in 1798. How come we all end up 40 years later in the Orange Order, being right-wing and being hostile to the ideas of the French Revolution? You've got, that's going on. I don't want to exaggerate it, but it's there, it's a phenomenon. And also, it's much easier for unionists to square in their minds that they're going into United Ireland for social and economic reasons, and not that the IRA has bombed them into it. Much more easy for them to square that. So, things are on the move. There's a lot of things happening. No one's getting killed, and that's good. The IRA leadership got its prisoners out of jail, which was exceptional. Remember the hunger strike. Like Tommy was on the first hunger strike, suffered years on the blanket protest, being humiliated as a British, and that was another thing they tried to do, try to criminalise our prisoners in order to criminalise our struggle, and they failed in that as well. So we never. My morale is quite good. I know there's ups and downs in electoral processes and in the publicity wars that take place, but I'm pretty comfortable in my skin. I know the direction of travel. Direction of travel isn't the union, strengthening the union. I don't feel a part of that. The direction of travel for many, many people, including many unionist people who are now having second thoughts about the link with Britain, is a new Ireland, a reconciled Ireland. And of course, I would prefer if it was a socialist republic, but I'm going to have to fight for that. That's another battle down the road.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Danny. Tommy, same question. What's your views on why did the IRA and Sinn Fein accept the Good Friday Peace Agreement in your view?
Well, I think again there's a number of reasons, many reasons for it. One is the length of the campaign. There's a question of exhaustion. Not defeat, but length of time it lasted. And I think we also have to keep in mind the numbers involved here. In the six counties, Northern Ireland, if you like to call it, at the moment there's about 1.8 to 1.9 million people. Through those early years was about 1.6 million people, of which about 0.7, 0.8% million were from the Catholic population. Largely the IRA was composed of working class people, small farmers, industrial workers. The middle class actually supported the constitutional movement for very simple class-based reasons, that very often a slight reform would help ease them into some position of influence or benefit flow. But we're talking probably about 300,000 to 400,000 people in that. Yeah, about 400,000 people in total, from which came the IRA, because while there was a southern input, Southern Irish volunteers, the vast majority of the IRA came from the six counties. Most of them, about half the membership of the IRA was Belfast. So you're talking about a very small, hundreds of thousands of people pitted against the might of the British Empire. And this, we're talking in terms of the British state. Now, Britain had never in spite of Margaret Thatcher's infamous statement about the Northern Ireland being as British as Finchley, never was. Northern Ireland was always regarded as a colony. From the very first day of the Troubles, Britain had signed its colonial army to address the problems in the 6 counties. It employed the tactics that had been developed in Kenya, Aden, Cyprus, Malaya, and as such, you're talking about, understandably, a small population against the might of the British Empire, using the most brutal tactics it knew. So it was understandable that after 25 years that there was at least a willingness to consider it an option. The IRA was relatively strong, and keep in mind too that Britain has an interest in the 6 counties. The 6 counties were always regarded not as a bastion of Orangism, but from the British point of view, Britain regarded the 6 counties of Northern Ireland as a garrison to protect its western flanks. That's why it set up the state in the first place in 1920. It wasn't at any grow or love of Unionists or Orange order. It was a cynical, strategic objective of Britain to maintain a living garrison on its western flank. And Britain had an empire. Time went by, of course. Geographical, geopolitical power basis shifted. The empire doesn't exist to any extent any longer. Technology has left the 6 counties no longer the strategic, essential part of the empire that it would have been in a century earlier. So Britain was willing to move to an extent, knowing that at a certain stage it was going to have to concede ground anyway in the 6 counties. While you did the IRA and the Republican base accepted well, as I said, it had been a long campaign. There was movement from the British, now not a huge amount, but also keep in mind that as a result of the IRA campaign, unionism, while still obdurate, uncompromising in public, there was an acceptance within the unionist population that it couldn't continue indefinitely. A lot of the middle class unionists were seeing their sons and daughters go here to England or to Britain to study, didn't come home, or the population was declining. A number of factors meant that unionism, while in public taking a position, a hardline position, there was a consensus, not universal consensus, but there was a significant percentage of the unionist population was willing at least to consider some alternative to an ongoing conflict. And therefore, the majority of the Republican movement accepted the leadership's recommendation that they would embark on a negotiation process, which, well, there's different views on how successful it was long term, but that'll be the reason, in my opinion, why it was the majority of Republican activists accepted the recommendation of the leadership to accept the negotiations and accept the Good Friday Agreement.
Great, thanks so much for that. And Marisa, same question. Why do you think the IRA and Sinn Fein accepted the Good Friday Agreement in your opinion?
I remember before the IRA ceasefires of the 90s, I remember going to primary school and going out into the front garden in West Belfast and running back in again because there was a British soldier lying with a rifle and it frightened the life out of me. And then my granda walked me to school and of course in various bushes you would see them. And then on a different day you would come out and you would see balaclavaed men and women walking through the street, and I remember saying to my mum, "Who's that?" "That's the IRA." And I think this whole, that was the day and daily experience for people on the ground when the IRA campaign was going on. And I do think there was a war weariness among the population that I think the IRA was aware of. I think that the IRA, at the same time as a war weariness, as Tommy said, nobody thought it was going to go on for as long as it did. But I think there was also an awareness that a stalemate was reached. And as Danny said, the IRA could continue fighting on, but how much more might they get for that, and what was the moral implication of that? So I think between the stalemate, the military stalemate that was reached between the IRA and the British Army, and the war weariness. I think that it produced this atmosphere, and also the talks, the political talks that were going on behind the scenes, that led to the Good Friday Agreement. I mean, the consent principle in the agreement, the main element of the Good Friday Agreement, it provided a way forward to pursue your aspiration of Irish unity non-violently. So the Good Friday Agreement, it wasn't about eradication of positions, it was about accommodation of positions. And I think that when you put those things all together, in my opinion, that's why the IRA saw, or the majority, as Tommy has said, saw that this was a non-violent way forward to still pursue the same objectives, but end in the long campaign that had such devastation, and then a lot of prisoners still in jail. There were a lot of people still in jail, so there were all those factors to consider, and I think that's why the majority probably did. And as Tommy has said, there's people out there who don't accept that, and have very different views on why they ended the campaign. But I think that's generally what happened.
Yeah, great, thanks very much. So I would concur with the panels, and Marisa, Danny and Tommy on this. I think that there's certainly in academic debates, there's been as the last, let's say, decade plus, there's a bit of an argument that's emerged, like, was the provisional IRA and Sinn Fein partly forced in a piece because of like British intelligence pressure or infiltration, and certainly like my previous work, and that's not to say, look, I think that informers working for British intelligence, these things had some impact on like the SAS, particularly some of the IRAs, which talks about European operations and like Gibraltar, and the East Tyrone IRA particularly would have been quite hard hit by the SAS. But I think if we look at it at a day-to-day level, these things have some difference, and the war weariness thing, that might have an element into that. But I think if we look overall, would those things have been important in pushing the IRA to peace? I don't really think so. And some of the reasons for that, certainly, like my own work would talk about. I think that in the city areas, Derry and Belfast, the IRA starts to adopt a cell structure after really by the mid to late 1970s. And so you have maybe 4 to 8 people per cell, roughly, and then that's not an exact number. And, yes, that wasn't foolproof. You're mixing people from different areas, maybe people with different ages. So the idea is you don't have a unit, which the IRA used to have in the early 70s, like your brigade, battalion, company structure, where, one person in a company comes an informer, while the other 19, 20 people could potentially get locked up, and how do you work out who the informer is? So I think, that's not to say, as various authors have said, that system was foolproof, because it wasn't. But I do think it probably helped, particularly more in Belfast, for separate reasons for Derry, why the campaign wound down. I think that in Belfast, why the IRA, you see in the 1990s, it's coming back to like bombing bits of the city centre again. So it clearly has a durability, and we've talked about that part here, like a persistence and able to continue its campaign. And I think the cell structure probably helps them to do that in terms of like filtering out people at times. Not foolproof, not perfect, but it had some effect on matters. I think then if we look at, say, like the rural areas for the IRA's campaign, again, we're probably, the exception of places like East Tyrone, which does get hit by the SAS various times after 1987 in particular. The IRA, particularly in places like South Armagh, to an extent, and I say rural areas, but smaller towns or areas, well, Armagh's a city, but nonetheless would have been a smaller unit in like North Mid Armagh. These units and British security forces and British archival documents that are coming out now say this, they are able to persist going into the 1990s. Again, different reasons for that. We've partly talked about that, like friends, family. That would be important in the cities as well. That shouldn't be played down, but it's particularly important as anyone who comes from a rural area would know, whatever the situation. Links between friends and family would be particularly strong in these areas. So certainly from a British intelligence perspective, they found that these areas were generally more difficult to infiltrate for these reasons. And the other reason for that means if we look at, say, the IRA's like leading body, which essentially would have been like its army council, so 7-person membership of that, we get the sense that probably it's not substantially infiltrated, or if it is, that 1 or 2 people are not having a substantial effect on things that we're able to do. 2 signs for that for me are the Libyan weapons shipments the IRA is bringing in from the mid to late 1980s. And there's a quote in Christopher Andrews' official history of MI5 where he's been into MI5, some of their archives, and they're saying themselves with that amount of material, the IRA can probably just persist indefinitely with what it's doing. So there's a reflection in the UK intelligence services about that because of this, it's fighting this kind of small-scale campaign. which those type of weapons coming in would allow them to persist. The last one gets stopped, that is true. But if your aim is persistence, and there's a debate in that, in certainly the academic work, is were the IRA trying to persist from the late 1970s, or were they trying to escalate their campaign? My own view is that they would essentially try to persist, and if you're doing that, one shipment of weapons stopping is probably not going to be terminal to your campaign coming in. And the IRA's campaign in England, we've talked about that slightly as well, like in terms of Brighton bombing, trying to target Margaret Thatcher in 1984, Downing Street Moors in 1991, John Major's government, various other bombings in London, Manchester bombing in 1996. And again, you'd expect those things would be stopped if there's significant infiltration, particularly at leadership level of the IRA and Sinn Fein. So I think that in that sense, they're able to persist. Totally agree with what the rest of the panel has said, but they're also in a political and armed stalemate at the same time with other forces. Yes, the IRA and Sinn Fein can keep going, but so can the opponents as well. And at this point during the conflict, they're winning a sizable minority in Northern Nationalist vote, about 35 to 40% consecutively, but it isn't the majority. And if you want to advance things going forward, then you probably have to look at trying to increase the political support. And I think there's a decision made that, yeah, the IRA's campaign might have some ceiling effect on that in the north. The last point I'd say on that as well, in terms of concessions, and it comes back to a point we were talking about earlier, you know, from the 1993 Downing Street Declaration by the British government and the Irish government, which eventually then this part of it just goes into the 98 peace agreement, the self-determination that's put into that, you know, that is the first time the British government has officially said and publicly said it's for the people of the island of Ireland alone to decide whether there'll be unification on the island. Now, that's not saying, as for example, like Gerry Adams' own works say, that's not exactly what Republicans want, because it's on a separate but concurrent basis, I think the word is in the peace agreement, about how there'd be a future self-determination referendum. But nonetheless, it is still the British government conceding publicly there will be, you know, the Irish nationalist perspective that the whole island should have a say on self-determination is in the agreement. The compromise aspect is that the fact that the unionist interpretation of what the North needs a separate say on this is also written into that, and that comes back to the particular points we were saying about, you know, the compromise aspect for all sides, where no one's actually particularly, you know, winning, they can say, from the settlement and agreement. But nonetheless, I think that's quite, and Gerry Adams' own work says that, and I think there's a point in that it is a significant concession, because it's the, you know, technically the British government is saying that they, in hindsight, might not have had a right to partition that place in the first place, because you conceded the people in the future have a right to undo that. So that would be my own thoughts on that. Okay, so the last question is, has the peace process, so it's an opinion on this, has the peace process strategy been successful for Sinn Fein, so the political, or was the political wing of the IRA? So has the peace process strategy been successful for Sinn Fein, in your opinion? We'll go with Tommy first on this question.
I'd have mixed views on that. It has certainly allowed Sinn Fein to flourish electorally, largest political party in the 6 counties, both in terms of its membership of the Stormont executive at local government level, and also its greatest number of MPs, although obviously abstentionist, in Westminster. So very successful in that sense. It has effectively displaced the SDLP as a political party, influential political party in the 6 counties. South of the border, it has now it's elected 37 TDs, or members of the Irish Parliament. The last election, I think a couple might have resigned since then, but at the same time, still a very significant number in comparison to what it used to be. So electorally, Sinn Fein has done remarkably well, I would argue. But having said that, it's within certain parameters that it has succeeded now. I'm of the opinion that republicanism is not something that is about uniting Ireland. Republicanism is about establishing a republic. And as I spoke earlier about the Peasants' Republic, in the 19th century, early days of the 20th century, it's now a workers' republic that's needed. And whether Sinn Fein has the strategy to achieve that aim, I'm not so sure at all. The point I made earlier about Britain, and Britain has its interests, always had its interests in Ireland. Now, whether it needs to exercise that by holding territory, possibly not. But will it seek to influence what's happening in Ireland? I think yes. to the extent that in 1920, 21, 22, the treaty, it decided against having an independent republic and promoted the concept of a free state, which was within dominion status within the empire. Now, Britain, at a certain level, is not really the deep state. The ruling class in Britain isn't really particularly interested in what flag flies over Belfast City Hall, as long as they exercise influence on the island. And I think that's where we have to be very careful about what's happening at the moment. And whether Sinn Fein is equipped to break that imperialist connection certainly is something I think is open to question, because I would argue, I'm sure this was not maybe universally accepted around this table, but I suspect Sinn Fein is too willing to adhere to that, if not British imperialism, certainly US imperialism. Sinn Fein is not committed to breaking the connection with capitalism. That's another thing for another day. That's where I have reservations about Sinn Féin's success. Actually, it has achieved significant progress, but whether it will deliver on the Workers' Republic, I'm not so sure. In fact, I'm sceptical about the ability to deliver on the Republic that has evolved, which needs to evolve into the future.
Great, thanks for that. Tommy, so turning to Danny, same question. Has the peace process strategy been successful for Sinn Féin in your view?
Well, I would argue that it has been. I would also say, in response to some of the things that Tommy has said, that there is no blueprint exists in history for revolutionary, how you have a successful revolution. So in our case here, down the years, we've had to think laterally. For a long time, we had a principal position: you do not recognise courts if you're charged with IRA membership. That was putting a lot of people in jail. The IRA decided, no, we'll recognise the courts in order to keep people out of jail. Similarly, they try to keep the British government unions, try to keep us out of the councils in the north by introducing an oath where you had to forswear the use of political violence. A lot of Republicans said, no, we can't take that there. I went to the meeting, I argued at the meeting, yes, we can. The IRA uses force, Brits use violence. Just by being, as cynical as that. Every time they put up an obstacle to you, you go through it, like a prisoner escaping from jail. You go through the wall, around the wall, under the wall, over the wall. You find a way of getting it to your objective. And this is a contingency about how we go about doing that. I don't see any other blueprint around, other plans which offer some degree of success. I know that we've raised the morale of the nationalist community right up there, that if you ask unionists, have they won the war? They will say no. They will say, if you listen to Gregory Campbell, for example, the DUP MP, oh, the nationalists are getting everything and we're getting nothing, which is not true. We're just trying to create equality. So we are in a process of trying to bring about reunification. In the process, wherever you have power, at local government, in the Assembly, in the Leinster House, if you can redistribute wealth, because all that I'm concerned about is moving the wealth from there down to there. That's my political philosophy, in a sentence. If you can do that along the way, by protecting women, by protecting education, old people, the ill, etc., that to me is radical republicanism. Because you can't wait until you get in the end and then implement all of these remarks. Along the way, you have to educate people, you have to convince people, you have to build support. And I think that the way it's been done now is probably the only way open to us. But however, if the British government was to come in again and try to treat me the way I was treated back in the 70s, well, then I would revert to being my 18, 19-year-old self. But I think we're going past that now. And I think they know that. And I think also the unionists know it. One of the biggest problems, I would say, is the 26 counties. Because the two parties down there who claim that's in their constitution, that they want reunification, they do not want reunification. They are happy with what they have, the 26 county state, which they call Ireland. Ireland? That's 26 counties. There's part of the battle there that has to win the ideological battle, where we have to win hearts and minds, because there's still a free state mentality in their DNA. And I think that's a major difficulty in terms of reunification.
Great, thanks so much for that. So Marisa, same question. Has the peace process strategy been successful for Sinn Féin in your opinion?
As a political party, massively so. I mean, we've talked about their electoral fortunes. Michelle O'Neill is now the First Minister in Northern Ireland. They hold the majority of support of the nationalist community across the north now. So, and they have substantial support in the south as well. So, as a political party, yeah, I think it's really paid dividends. I mean, I know that it's often put in academic debates that there was a glass ceiling on support for Sinn Fein whilst the IRA campaign was going on. Once the IRA ceasefires happened, it removed for many people an objection to voting for Sinn Fein, and so many former SDLP voters then switched their allegiance to Sinn Fein, and so it's paid off electorally in terms of that. Of course it has. I think in terms of has it been a success, I think Danny talked about the South and the big problem that there is there. I think the removal of Articles 2 and 3 from the Irish Constitution were a big issue, because the fact that the Irish Constitution claimed territory, claimed the territory of the North, I think that was a big, very, very important thing. And when that was removed, to me, that was a big problem, a big issue that happened. But it happened in tandem with the Good Friday Agreement. And I think in terms of Republican objectives, I think the reality of these things and of peace processes are that no, you won't get everything you want, and that it is. I remember I interviewed Gerry Adams, and he said that the Good Friday Agreement, he got a bit annoyed because I called it a settlement, and he says it's not a settlement. He said, it's a journey, and we haven't agreed on the destination yet. So we still have to see in terms of where we're going to go with this. But I do think in terms of achieving Republican objectives, there's obviously a lot of critics out there. And in my work, I've been interviewing many of them in terms of the Good Friday Agreement and what would be termed so-called dissident Republicans. I don't like that word. I don't find it useful or helpful. I know we've debated this in the past, Danny. But in terms of that so-called dissident base, I mean, they very strongly will criticise Sinn Féin and very strongly will criticise acceptance of the Good Friday Agreement, because they will say that Sinn Féin, in becoming so popular, has moved away from the traditional Republican position. Now, of course, that's a dissident Republican argument, and Sinn Féin will strongly refute that. But that dissident base, who comprises of many people who were active in the provisional movement, they will very much say that no, the Good Friday Agreement did not achieve Republican objectives. It actually achieved a constitutional nationalist objective in terms of accepting the consent principle. So I think it's a very, very complicated question, and it's a very complicated thing to look at, and I think we're still seeing the outplaying of it. But in terms of as a political party, I don't think we can deny that it's been very successful for Sinn Féin.
Okay, yeah, thanks. And so my own kind of concluding thoughts on this are, yes, in terms of, again, as a political strategy, successful like North and South. North much earlier on in terms of being able to overtake the SDLP, and as Danny mentioned, that happens quite quickly by like 2001 after the peace process, which is also interesting because it would kind of tell us, if you're evaluating this, probably, this sense that the leadership of the movement would have had that, well, hang on, if the IRA's campaign isn't there, potentially there's some people who might come over, tipping you from the 40% of Northern Nationalist vote to the SDLP 60, you could start swinging it. And that does seem the case quite early on. And so that would be key in the North. And, what's significant, obviously, what's happened now in the North is that, they now become the largest party electorally in the North as well, so overtaking what predominantly would have been like the DUP in more recent years, Democratic Unionist Party. And obviously that's quite significant because it goes back to what we were saying earlier, that, comments from leading unionists in the 30s that Northern Ireland is a Protestant state for Protestant people. And, therefore that shows a change, certainly politically, that Sinn Féin are able to say is a sign of success, that hasn't been the case anymore there. In the Republic, I think the reasons are different in the Republic because the growth, the party does get TD elected in 1997, and its TDs are going up quite gradually up to about 2010, top of my head. I think particularly the economic crash in the Republic has a quite sizable effect, partly on the party's growth and opposition to how the southern economy in particular was being run previous to 2008 when there was the crash. And I think that, in recent years in particular, where they focused on socio-economic system in the Republic, criticisms of that, plus criticisms of things like the healthcare system, that seemed to help them in the last election we had in 2020. So this, I should say for the video purpose, the talk today is early November in 2024, so there is a election coming up in the Republic, so we'll see how that pans out. So I think some of the reasons would have been different in the South, and I think there's an interesting debate within the party about, whether you went to more central strategy, whether you stuck on the kind of left of the Southern Irish politics, and that strategy kind of had borne out by 2020 because it gave them a position to criticise the main parties and what they saw as a kind of lack of development for people socioeconomically in the Republic, particularly more like working class and middle class people, difficulties would have experienced there. Potentially as a debate at the moment, has that support stagnated compared to 2020? We'll see how that bears out in the election in the forthcoming weeks. The one point I would say, I think this is the same for the SDLP and the Irish government, although for some of the reasons we talked about here, that maybe this wasn't on the SDLP and Irish government's radar in 1998, and maybe because of the fact that Sinn Fein, as we said, we're getting about 40% Northern Nationalist electorate. How much leeway can you get on the point I'm about to mention when the other parties, the SDLP and the Irish government, with Irish nationalism, might not back you on this, is that, so like Sinn Fein not attending Westminster, there's an argument, well, you don't need to sit in Westminster Party because of the fact that Irish self-determination has already been granted by the British government. You don't need to sit in Westminster to get that right. And I would say that's accurate. As a position, I think that's accurate. I think it's an oversight, perhaps, on Irish nationalism's side from the Good Friday Agreement about the mechanism of how that vote would happen. Just in terms of, at the second, from what I can see, there might be some consultation with the Irish Minister for Foreign Affairs or the Irish Taoiseach, but the British government and the British Northern Ireland Secretary of State, they're the ones who have the ability in terms of look at the polls and then say, there needs to be a poll held on both sides of the border. So that might be a slight oversight, but having said that, I wouldn't significantly stress that just because I'm sure if the polls work, because my point there would be the British government could turn around and say, well, we're not holding it, even if we look at the polls and we're not going to hold that vote, so yep. But I actually think probably with Labour governments that are in position, they probably wouldn't do that. I would generally probably feel the same with Conservative governments, although the more recent years, where they've upset some of their international partners with things like Brexit, I'm not sure necessarily that situation that could arise. But nonetheless, I think the British government would be under considerable pressure if the polls were clearly showing a preference north and south for Irish unification to hold that vote. And I think it comes back to the point like Danny and Tommy have said. I do think, in recent years, the British government, the reasons of wanting Northern Ireland to stay within the UK for the British government are different to like Ulster Unionism. So I think they wouldn't necessarily be, they would maybe vocally say they were against it and a campaign on it, but I don't think necessarily it wound kind of British unionisms in England, Scotland and Wales as it would if Scotland or like Wales left the UK. I think it would be a different situation because of how Ireland would have been seen differently, even from the British government in the terms of how it was governed as well. So I just want to thank the panel members, and we've had a fascinating discussion. Hopefully people have learned some things from it, some different perspectives. So Tommy McKearney, Marisa McGlinchey, Danny Morrison and myself. And we have another discussion, actually, you wouldn't see this on the video, but filmed later, about Irish Republicanism since 1969. There'll be some slightly different questions, so hopefully listening to the two will help people in the audience have a better insight, and you can make your own minds up what you think from there. So
this was a rehearsal.
This was the rehearsal for later, yeah. The bigger then. Thanks very much. Thank you.